In 1913, the mills and sheds of Lancashire processed roughly 65% of all the cotton on Earth. 65%. Not of Britain's cotton, not of Europe's, but of the planet's. The year before, in 1912, the region had turned out around 8 billion yards of woven cloth, enough to wrap the equator thousands of times over. On the trading floor of the Royal Exchange in Manchester, buyers and sellers set the price of cotton for every continent under a single roof, in a room Mancunians called the largest in the world. That was the peak. Today, Manchester's population stands at roughly half what it reached at its highest point. The mills are apartments. The trading floor closed in 1968 and is now a theater. The cotton, which built the modern world's first industrial city, has been gone for 2 generations. The distance between those two facts is one of the great unraveling stories of industrial civilization. And it begins not with a machine or a merchant, but with the rain. Chapter 1. The Rain and the Coal. It falls still. Manchester receives more than 30 inches of rain in an average year, carried off the Atlantic and pushed inland by westerlies that climb the western face of the Pennine Hills and empty themselves over the Lancashire plain with a consistency that the calendars of other English cities would call exceptional, and that Manchester simply calls autumn or winter or March. The damp is not dramatic. It is persistent, a low gray ceiling that settles in for days and does not make a spectacle of itself. It was this quality, not the violence of a storm but the constancy of moisture in the air, that made what came later possible. Cotton thread is a delicate thing under tension. A dry atmosphere makes the fibers brittle, and a brittle fiber snaps when the spindle turns at any speed worth turning it. The mills that appeared in drier parts of England and Scotland in the late 18th century fought this condition with expensive workarounds: wet cellars, water-soaked walls, contraptions for keeping the air from drying out. None of them reliable, all of them costs. In Manchester, the air arrived pre-humidified, free of charge, every morning of the year. The thread did not snap. The machines could run at the speeds the new patents demanded. The damp Pennine climate was not a nuisance to the cotton trade. It was the cotton trade's first and most important subsidy, one that no competitor in a drier geography could replicate at any price. The water that fell on the western Pennines did something else on its way down to the town. It passed through old sandstone and millstone grit, which stripped it of dissolved minerals, calcium, magnesium, the compounds that make water hard and that ruin the chemistry of textile dyeing by interfering with every color the dye worker tries to fix. Soft water accepts dye cleanly. It bleaches without clouding. The Irwell, the Irk, the Medlock descended to the valley floor already prepared for the finishing trades. They were not metaphors for the city's convenience. They were industrial infrastructure provided free. Beneath the town, closer to the surface than almost anywhere else in England, lay the Lancashire coal field. Not coal to be fetched from a distance, not coal that required a long haul and a transfer of hands to arrive at the city's edge. Coal in seams that ran almost directly under the streets. Coal that could be mined a few miles out and carried in on a short journey at low cost. Energy that was cheap before it was made cheaper still. 35 miles to the west, at the mouth of the Mersey, lay Liverpool, already a deep-water Atlantic port with the infrastructure for oceanic trade, already handling the ships that crossed to the American South and returned loaded with raw cotton from the plantations of Georgia and Carolina and Alabama. Rain from the Pennines, soft water from the hills, coal from the ground, a port at Liverpool. 4 conditions in one place simultaneously. The Romans had understood the valley's position, if not its potential. Around the year 79, they built a fort they called Mamucium on a sandstone bluff at the confluence of the Irwell and the Medlock, a defensive position on the road network that connected the northern legions. The fort controlled a crossing. It guarded a route. For 17 centuries, after the legions left, Manchester remained a market town, a place where the surrounding countryside brought its goods and moved on. Provincial, unremarkable in the manner of 1,000 English market towns that never became anything else. The accident was not any single event. It was the coincidence. Rain that kept the thread whole, water that kept the color true, coal that kept the machines turning, a port that kept the raw material arriving. Each condition alone was useful. Together they were, in the quiet arithmetic of economic geography, the closest thing to an inevitability that the industrial age produced. Keep the rain in mind. It will come back. A place that did one thing at a scale no place had attempted, and built a world on it, and made the mistake of believing that the conditions which made it possible were permanent. That story begins in 1761 with a canal. Chapter 2. The Canal and the Machine. In 1761, a strip of still water opened across the Lancashire plain and changed the arithmetic of energy. The Bridgewater Canal was built by Francis Egerton, the third Duke of Bridgewater, who owned coal mines at Worsley and wanted a cheaper way to move coal into Manchester. He hired James Brindley, a self-taught millwright from Derbyshire who had never built a canal. The cost was £168,000. Within a year, the price of coal in Manchester had fallen by roughly half. Not by a few percent, by half. A town paying one price for the fuel that drove its machinery was now paying the other, permanently, because the distance between the mines and the market had been reduced to a barge moving on water. The success launched a national frenzy of canal construction, but Manchester had come first. That head start was not nothing. The second ingredient was the machine, and it arrived in 3 stages, each erasing what the previous generation had understood about how thread was made. The spinning jenny was the work of James Hargreaves, a Lancashire weaver and carpenter who in the 1760s built a device that let a single operator spin multiple threads at once. The jenny was small enough for a cottage. Then Richard Arkwright patented the water frame in 1769, and the economics shifted for good. The water frame was too heavy for a kitchen, too dependent on continuous water power to run anywhere except beside a fast stream. It required a building, a room full of workers, a factory. Samuel Crompton completed the transformation in 1779 with the spinning mule, a hybrid that produced finer thread than either predecessor. 3 machines, 3 inventors, 1 generation, and the craft that had organized Lancashire domestic life for centuries was obsolete. Work moved out of the cottage and into the mill because the arithmetic demanded it. A spinner at home could not compete with a factory running 50 mules. The migration worked itself out household by household until the cottage spinner was the anomaly. Enter Robert Owen. He was a Welsh-born draper's apprentice who had learned the textile trade through positions across England, absorbing the business with the attention of someone who understood that commerce was the vehicle and self-improvement was the destination. In 1789, the Manchester merchant Peter Drinkwater built a cotton mill in Piccadilly and equipped it with something new, the first Boulton and Watt rotative steam engine installed in a city spinning mill. The engine changed the geography of industrial power in a single demonstration. A water frame required a fast-running river. A steam engine required coal, a boiler, and firm ground. Manchester had coal delivered cheaply by the Bridgewater Canal and firm ground in abundance. Drinkwater hired Owen, then 20 years old, to manage the operation. Owen ran the mill for nearly a decade, refining its processes, learning what a well-ordered factory could produce. He left in 1799, taking the reputation he had built in Piccadilly North to New Lanark, in Scotland, where he spent the following decades constructing a model industrial community that the next century argued about without settling. The engine stayed. What it had demonstrated stayed with it. Once power no longer depended on a river, the map opened entirely. A water-powered mill was anchored to whatever geography a river had chosen. A steam-powered mill was a proposition. Take it where the coal is cheap, where the ground is flat, where workers can walk to it. Mills rose on the land north and east of the city center, away from the streams the earlier generation had required. Mill neighborhoods appeared in a decade. By 1830, Manchester held 99 cotton-spinning mills. 99. In 1761, the year Brindley's barges first moved coal down the Bridgewater Canal, Manchester was a market town with no claim on the future. 70 years later, it was something that had not existed before. A city organized entirely around the machine, its buildings built for production, its air already carrying the coal smoke that visitors would remark on for a century. The canal had delivered the energy. The machines had concentrated the labor. The steam engine had cut the last tie to the river. What was growing in Manchester by 1830 was not simply an industry. It was a new arrangement of human life. And it had become, without anyone announcing it, the shape of the modern world. Chapter 3. Cottonopolis. By the first decades of the 19th century, Manchester was doing one thing, and doing it at a scale no city had attempted. Raw cotton arrived at Liverpool from the American South in bales, hundreds of thousands of tons per year, crossing the Atlantic on vessels that made the same passage in both directions. The bales moved by canal the 35 miles inland to the mills of Manchester, where the machines broke them open and turned them, over the course of long shifts, into finished cloth. That cloth left for every continent. It went to India, to West Africa, to China. The city received raw fiber and returned fabric, and the difference in value between the two was the fortune on which Manchester stood. No city had organized itself so completely around a single transaction. The air tasted of coal. The light was the light that gets through coal smoke, which is not quite the light of anywhere else. The chimneys defined the skyline in the way that spires define other cities. By 1830, 99 cotton-spinning mills operated within Manchester, and the smoke from their stacks did not disperse on still mornings but settled. A dense canopy that turned noon into something dimmer than noon, that left a film on windows a mile from the nearest mill and further. Visitors wrote about it with the consistency of people recording a geographical feature. The machines did not pause for Sunday in the way that doctrine recommended. The machines paused for nothing. It was into this city, on the 15th of September 1830, that the first railway arrived. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway was the first in the world to link two major cities with a timetabled service, locomotive-hauled, operating on a published schedule with fares and booking. It connected the mills of Manchester to the deep-water docks of Liverpool, 35 miles away, by a track over which a locomotive could move loaded wagons in a fraction of the time a canal barge required. The journey that had taken the better part of a day by road took under 2 hours on the rails. The commercial logic was immediate and total. Cotton coming in, cloth going out. The turnaround time collapsed. The opening ceremony drew members of Parliament and civic dignitaries, and a crowd that understood it was witnessing a departure from the previous arrangement of the world. William Huskisson, the Member of Parliament for Liverpool and a former president of the Board of Trade, stepped down from his carriage onto the tracks during a pause in the proceedings. George Stephenson's locomotive rocket was approaching on the adjacent line. Huskisson was struck. He was carried by locomotive to Engels, where a surgeon attended to him. He died that evening. The first widely reported railway death in history, killed by the machine that was reordering the world his career had helped to build. The opening celebrations continued. The railway began its regular service the following day. The warehouses came alongside, rising through the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s as the trade expanded, and the merchants who profited from it required places to hold the cloth, show the cloth, and administer its accounts. Manchester was called Warehouse City, not a compliment, not a criticism, a fact. They were palaces of commerce, built in brick and sandstone, 5 and 6 stories tall, fronted with pilasters and arched windows and cornices borrowed from Italian palazzos. They were not factories. No weaving happened inside them. They were showrooms and counting houses, places where a buyer from Edinburgh or Bombay or Paris could inspect samples, place an order, and watch the transaction entered in a ledger. The hydraulic cranes on their loading bays lifted bales and bolts from the street below. There were thousands of them. They rose along Princess Street, Portland Street, and Mosley Street, block after block of civic, scaled commercial architecture in a city that had not existed in recognizable form 60 years before. They were the physical record of a fortune being made and remade continuously, and they were built with the materials of permanence. Brick and sandstone outlast the transactions they were built to house. The merchants who raised them believed they were building infrastructure for a trade that would run as long as there was cotton in the American South and mills in Lancashire. They were not wrong about the buildings. The buildings are still there. Keep the warehouses in mind. They will come back. Chapter 4. Peterloo. The fortune was built on labor that had no say in how it was governed, no representative in Parliament, and no legal mechanism for putting one there. The men who owned the mills did not write laws requiring it to be otherwise. The men who ran the machines owned nothing at all, and on the 16th of August, 1819, a crowd of about 60,000 of them, men, women, and children, dressed in their Sunday clothes, many having walked for hours along the Pennine lanes, gathered on a field beside St. Peter's Church to ask, with banners and speeches and no weapons, that Parliament be reformed so they might have some share in it. The Manchester and Salford yeomanry rode into the crowd. So did the 15th Hussars, called in to reinforce them. The crowd was dense and had nowhere to go. 18 people were killed. Several hundred were wounded, cut by sabers, crushed beneath hooves, trampled in the press of bodies fleeing a field they had entered peacefully. A local paper found the name within days. The Peterloo Massacre, a bitter echo of Waterloo. In 1821, a Manchester newspaper was founded to give the reform cause a voice. It was called the Manchester Guardian. No senior figure was charged with any crime. The organizers of the meeting were prosecuted. The cavalry officers received the formal thanks of the Prince Regent. The cotton kept moving. The machines kept turning. Something else was happening in the streets below the mill floors. The wealth and the squalor stood a few streets apart. The warehouses along Princess Street and the cellars of Little Ireland, where families lived below the level of the river and where disease moved the way damp moves, through walls, through floors, through everything. Cholera arrived in 1832 and again in 1849. Typhus was not an event, but a condition. In 1842, Friedrich Engels arrived in Manchester. He had been sent by his father to work in the family textile firm. He was 21. He stayed through 1844, and in those 2 years, he walked the districts the merchants on Princess Street had no occasion to enter: Little Ireland, the Irk Valley, the back courts off Deansgate. He recorded what he saw with the attention of someone who understood that documentation was the first act of resistance. The book he published from those notes in 1845, The Condition of the Working Class in England, described the cellars, the cholera, the children in the mills, the life expectancy in Angel Meadow, the courts where sunlight did not reach. It was not a polemic. It was an inventory. The evidence he gathered in those districts would help shape the politics of the next century. Keep those districts in mind. They will come back. The city that had produced the Peterloo Massacre had also, by the end of the 1830s, produced the framework for dismantling the trade laws the massacre had not been enough to change. The Anti-Corn Law League was founded in Manchester in 1838. Its strategist was Richard Cobden, a calico printer and merchant who understood that the corn laws, tariffs that kept the price of imported grain high, protecting the landowners who set them, and starving the workers who could not afford bread, were the economic foundation of the same political class that had thanked the cavalry at Peterloo. Its orator was John Bright, a Rochdale mill owner whose voice parliamentary reporters of the time described as unlike anything the Commons had heard. Cobden made the argument. Bright made the argument felt. Their campaign forced the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, and the ideas it assembled, free trade, open markets, the removal of protection for domestic producers, were named the Manchester School. The movement built itself a monument. The Free Trade Hall went up on Peter Street in the decade following repeal, its facade a Palladian front in the Italian style. It stood on St. Peter's Field, the same ground, the ground where the cavalry had ridden into the crowd in 1819, where 18 people had died asking for a voice in Parliament. That ground was now occupied by a monument to the doctrine Manchester had made and exported. A hall named for free trade built where free workers had been cut down. The city raised it without recorded acknowledgement of the coincidence. The hall stood. The ground remembered nothing. Chapter 5. The Biggest Room in the World. In 1853, Manchester was granted city status. It had been, in practice, the organizing center of the world's most consequential industry for 30 years. The designation changed nothing about the smoke, or the machines, or the hours. It ratified what the chimneys had already argued. At the commercial heart of the new city stood the Royal Exchange. It had existed in earlier, smaller forms, but it was rebuilt and expanded across the decades with the deliberate ambition of men who understood that the room had to match the trade, and the trade had no limit they could see. The great hall that resulted was the actual center of the cotton market, not the nominal one, the floor where contracts were written, where prices were called, where the intelligence of 1,000 transactions accumulated each morning into the market rate for cotton across the planet. Mancunians boasted it was the biggest room in the world, not the largest trading room, not the largest hall in England, the biggest room in the world. On a busy day, thousands of buyers and sellers moved across that floor, setting the price of cotton for every continent simultaneously. By the 1890s, the city decided the scale of commerce had outgrown its geography, and the geography had to change. The answer was the Manchester Ship Canal. 35 miles long, dug through Lancashire clay and sandstone by hand, and by mechanical excavator over 6 years. When it opened in January 1894, it had cost just over £15 million. Queen Victoria performed the official opening in May of that year. Ocean-going ships now sailed 35 miles up the canal from the Mersey estuary and docked in Manchester, which became, after opening day, Britain's third busiest port. Not a river port, a port. The same ships that crossed the Atlantic now unloaded at the same city where the cotton went into the machines. A landlocked city had made itself a coastline. £15 million and 6 years of labor, and the geography changed. Picture the exchange floor on a trading morning in 1910. The room is larger than a cathedral nave. The noise is not the noise of machines. It is the noise of men making decisions. Hundreds of conversations run simultaneously. The buyers are there from India, from Egypt, from the American South. The sellers represent mills in Bolton, in Blackburn, in Oldham. Prices move in the morning the way tides move, responding to harvests in Alabama and frosts in Egypt and the output of new mills in Osaka. Manchester does not merely participate in the global cotton market. Manchester is where it takes place. In 1912, Lancashire produced around 8 billion yards of cotton cloth. 8 billion yards in a single year from the mills of a single English region. By the following year, the region was processing roughly 65% of the world's cotton. No single place had ever controlled so large a share of any global commodity. Not coal, not iron, not grain. The men on the exchange floor had lived their professional lives inside this fact, grown up with fathers who had said it, and grandfathers who had watched it become true. They had no framework for imagining it otherwise. The room was full. The ships were arriving. The prices were holding. That is the quality of a peak that holds. It does not announce itself as the highest point. It presents itself as the ordinary condition, indistinguishable from the one that preceded it. The men on the exchange floor in 1913 were not celebrating. They were conducting business, which was what they did every morning, because the business was always there to conduct. The canal was moving ships, the mills were running. The room, the biggest room in the world, was full of the noise of a trade that showed no sign of ending. What shows no sign of ending is already, in the nature of things, closest to its end. But that reckoning does not belong here. Not yet. Chapter 6. The Crack in the Foundation. And then, very quietly, the conditions changed. Not on any single morning. Not with any announcement from the exchange floor that declared the terms had shifted. The men conducting business in 1913 were conducting the same business they had conducted in 1912, and the business was real. Ships arriving, contracts written, mills running through the night. The crack was not visible from the floor of the biggest room in the world. It ran beneath it. Manchester had built its dominion on a single commodity, cotton. Not cotton alongside iron or alongside wool. Not cotton as one trade among several that balanced the city's economy against the failure of any one of them. Cotton alone, at a scale that made any hedge seem unnecessary. The merchants and mill owners who stood on the exchange floor had not blundered into this position. They had chosen it, repeatedly and rationally, because cotton had always paid, and because the infrastructure, the canal, the railway, the port, the Pennine air itself, had been built specifically to serve it. You do not diversify away from a thing that has never failed you. That is what they believed. The ledgers for 40 years had confirmed it. The machines told a different story. Lancashire's mills were running on the spinning mule, the older instrument, the one Samuel Crompton had perfected in 1779, the one the county had never seen reason to replace. Abroad, the ring frame was spreading. It was faster, required less skill, and meant cheaper labor and easier scaling. Mills in the American South ran ring frames. Mills rising in India and Japan were built for ring frames. Lancashire did not convert at scale. The mills were paid for, the workers were trained. The system worked well enough that the argument for reinvestment never quite closed. A culture of confidence, earned over 2 generations of dominance, had become a reluctance to question the machinery that dominance rested on. The confidence was real. The machinery was aging. The break, when it came, did not come from inside the industry. In August 1914, the shipping lanes that carried Lancashire cloth to its customers were severed and reorganized for 4 years of war. The foreign markets, India first, Japan alongside it, did not wait. Cut off from Lancashire goods, merchants in Bombay and Osaka commissioned mills. New mills. Ring frame mills, staffed by workers earning a fraction of Lancashire wages, built behind tariff walls, financed by capital that the interruption of the old supply had made urgent. The mills rose while the war ran. When the armistice came in November 1918, Manchester expected the trade to resume. It did not resume. The world no longer needed Manchester to make its cloth because the world had learned, under the pressure of necessity, to make its own. Countries that had been customers had become competitors. Better equipped, structurally cheaper, and not about to return. The export markets that had taken Lancashire decades to cultivate had been permanently reassigned in 4 years, not reduced, gone. What followed was not a crash. A crash is quick and is followed by the hope of recovery. What followed was slower, a long, implacable strangulation that wore through the 1920s and into the 1930s without resolution, without a clean bottom that would have allowed rebuilding. Mill after mill went idle. Employment fell. Through Bolton, Blackburn, Oldham, Burnley, the pattern repeated: partial closures first, then total closures. Then the particular silence of a mill standing with its machinery still inside and no one to run it. Lancashire had organized its entire social and physical geography around a single trade. Single industry dependency is an advantage while the industry ascends, and an extraordinary liability when it does not. The concentration that had made the region the most productive textile district on earth made it uniquely exposed. There was no other industry to absorb the displaced hands. There had never needed to be. The confidence was gone. The exchange floor still operated. Some orders still moved, some mills still ran. But the scale had contracted. The ships still came up the canal, but fewer of them. Manchester entered the 1930s a city in chronic depression, living on the memory of a dominance that had seemed, from that floor in 1913, as permanent as the rain. Chapter 7. The Long Strangulation. The war came to Manchester on the night of the 22nd of December, 1940. Over 3 nights, the 22nd to the 24th of December, an estimated 684 people were killed, and more than 2,000 were injured. The Christmas Blitz, the papers called it afterward, the name carrying the particular sourness of an event that required no elaboration. The bombs accomplished something the preceding decades of market contraction had not. They struck, partially and violently, the physical monuments the cotton fortune had raised. The Free Trade Hall burned. The Royal Exchange was damaged. Manchester Cathedral took a direct hit. The Free Trade Hall, built on the ground of Peterloo, raised as a monument to the doctrine that free trade had made, its Palladian front scorched. The Royal Exchange, the biggest room in the world, where thousands of buyers and sellers had set the price of cotton for every continent simultaneously, its hall now open to December sky in places. Manchester Cathedral, the oldest building in a city that had remade itself so many times it had nearly forgotten the settlements beneath the industrial ones. The bombs did not discriminate by chapter. The buildings were rebuilt, as Manchester had always rebuilt. But the repair could not restore the conditions that had given them their original meaning. The strangulation continued on its own schedule. What followed the armistice of 1945 was not recovery. The foreign markets lost in the First World War had not returned between the wars, and they did not return after the second one. What remained of Lancashire's cotton trade faced customers who had been making their own cloth for 30 years, on newer machines, at lower costs, behind their own tariff walls. By 1958, Britain had become a net importer of cotton cloth for the first time in 2 centuries. Not a reduced exporter, an importer. The line in the trade records carries no drama. It is simply a number on the wrong side of a column. The mills closed at a rate approaching 1 a week through the 1960s and 1970s. In Bolton, in Blackburn, in Oldham, in Burnley, the machines silenced, the hands laid off, the buildings left standing because no one had a plan for what they might become. Lancashire had no other industry of sufficient scale to absorb what the mills were releasing. The concentration that had made the region the most productive textile district on earth had become, at the point of failure, the measure of how little else there was. In 1968, the Royal Exchange shut its trading floor for the last time. The cotton market that had run the world, that had filled the biggest room in the world with the noise of thousands of transactions, that had set prices from Bombay to New Orleans under one Manchester roof, was finally silent, not reduced, silent. The floor that had been the center of the global cotton market became, in time, a theater. The room is still there. The trade is not. The city emptied as the work left. Manchester's population had peaked at 766,311 in 1931. By 2001, it had fallen to around 422,700, roughly half. The arithmetic is straightforward, and it is the arithmetic of departure. People leaving for cities with work, for arrangements the shrinking economy of the center could no longer offer. What remained in the inner city was the collar of obsolete factories and Victorian slums that the departing trade had left behind, and the concrete estates built in the post-war decades to replace those slums, which failed on their own terms as completely as the slums had failed on theirs. The Hume Crescents. Vast deck-access blocks raised on cleared back-to-back terraces were condemned before the decade was over. A city that had built its fortune in red brick and sandstone tried to solve its decline in concrete. The concrete did not hold. The smoke, at least, was gone. The chimneys that had turned Manchester's noon into something dimmer than noon, that had announced the city's productive power to every traveler approaching from the Pennines. Cold now, or demolished, or standing without purpose above machines that had stopped. The rain still fell, patient off the Atlantic, on a city the cotton trade had made and then finished with. The rain that had kept the thread from snapping, that had been the trade's first and oldest subsidy, still there. Everything it had made possible, gone. Chapter 8. The Bomb. By the early 1980s, Manchester looked like a city the modern world had finished with. The warehouses stood empty along the canals, their loading bays sealed. The canals themselves lay stagnant, carrying nothing. The smoke that had blotted out the noon sun for a century and a half was simply gone, replaced not by clean air in any hopeful sense, but by absence, the absence of the energy that had made the dirt. The place that invented the industrial city had become a case study in what happens after the industry leaves. Then, on the 15th of June 1996, the Provisional Irish Republican Army parked a lorry on Corporation Street in the city center. The lorry contained 1,500 kilograms of explosive. It was the largest bomb detonated in Britain since the Second World War. A telephoned warning had preceded it, and police had spent the preceding hours evacuating a cordon through the heart of the city, clearing shoppers from the streets, emptying stores and offices, pushing people back from the surrounding blocks. More than 200 people were injured, most of them caught at the edges of the cordon as the blast expanded beyond its expected radius. No one was killed. The 700 million pounds in damage fell on buildings rather than on people, on glass and masonry and Victorian cast iron and the brick bones of the warehouses that decades of decline had already emptied of purpose. The crater it left in the old city was by every conventional measure a catastrophe. And then, against every logic that catastrophe normally follows, it became something else. The rebuilding that the bomb forced was the rebuilding that a decade of urban planning had failed to deliver. Manchester's city centre had been caught between its Victorian inheritance and the hesitations of a city that lacked the confidence, or the capital, or both, to replace what the cotton economy had left with something the new economy could use. The bomb removed that hesitation in an afternoon. It opened a hole in the center, and the hole demanded an answer. The answer was investment, public and private money channeled into streets defined, for 40 years, by slow failure. New buildings rose. The Arndale Center was rebuilt and extended. Corporation Street was redesigned. The gap became, in the years that followed, physical proof that the city could still be remade. But the bomb had not arrived in an empty city. Something had been growing in Manchester for the better part of a decade before, and it had nothing to do with planning policy. It had to do with music. Factory Records was founded in 1978 by a former television presenter named Tony Wilson. The label he built operated without the normal constraints of the music business. Acts owned their own contracts, cash flow was chronically unreliable, and what the label had instead of discipline was the city. Joy Division came out of Salford, and their sound carried the post-industrial landscape in its architecture. Gray, structured around a tension that never resolved. When their singer Ian Curtis died in 1980, the remaining members continued as New Order, building dance music that still carried the industrial North in its bones. Wilson opened the Hacienda in 1982 in a converted yacht showroom on Whitworth Street West, and it ran for 15 years on money it did not have. The bands that gathered around Factory and the Hacienda, Joy Division, New Order, the Smiths, the Stone Roses, Oasis, were not a coordinated movement. They shared a city, a quality of cheap rent and northern weather, and the particular ambition of people who have grown up in a place the wider culture has spent decades discounting. The press called it Madchester. The name was shorthand. The thing was real. For the first time in half a century, young people came to Manchester on purpose. Not to work, not because the mills were hiring, but because the city was the most exciting place in Britain. The population had been falling since 1931. The music had made Manchester somewhere people chose to be again. The bomb and the bands were not connected in any causal sense. They arrived in sequence. The cultural revival first, the destruction second, the rebuilding third, in a sequence that a city less exhausted might have arranged deliberately. Manchester managed it accidentally. A city that had been written off began, improbably, to draw people back. Chapter 9. What the Brick Remembers. The institutions, as they tend to, followed the culture. In 2002, Manchester hosted the Commonwealth Games, and the stadium built for them became the home of Manchester City. The BBC moved much of its operation north to Media City, UK, across the water in neighbouring Salford. Finance settled in. The universities expanded. Two of the most famous football clubs on earth filled the psychic space the cotton had left. The city that had once run on the arithmetic of spinning and weaving now ran on the arithmetic of transfer fees and broadcast rights. The math was different. The brick was the same. What the planners discovered, and what the developers confirmed, was that Manchester's industrial inheritance was not rubble. It was an asset. The vast cotton warehouses that had risen along Princess Street and Portland Street in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s, built in brick and sandstone 5 and 6 stories tall, fronted with Italianate cornices and arched windows, designed to project the authority of a trade the merchants believed would run forever, those buildings were still standing. They had outlasted their purpose by half a century, and they turned out to be exactly what a post-industrial city required. The loading bays became lobbies. The counting floors became apartments, offices, hotel rooms, and bars where, on any given Friday evening, no one present was thinking about cotton. The merchants had built for permanence and had, without intending to, provided for a future they could not have imagined. The 1830 terminus of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the building from which the first scheduled locomotive-hauled passenger service in the world departed, the building from which William Huskisson's mortally injured body was carried on the day the railway opened, became the Science and Mancian Industry Museum. The oldest surviving passenger railway station on Earth now houses the history of what happened after it was built. Steam engines that once ran on lines it dispatched are displayed inside it. The building that began the Industrial Age contains the evidence of the Industrial Age in glass cases. The station is still there. The train no longer comes. Manchester is again one of Britain's fastest-growing cities. Its population, which had fallen from 766,311 in 1931 to around 422,700 by 2001, has been climbing back. But the new prosperity sits unevenly on the old poverty. The inner districts that Friedrich Engels walked between 1842 and 1844, the streets he documented not as a polemicist, but as a man recording what was directly in front of him, are not the slums he described. The specific courts and cellars of Little Ireland are long gone. But the geography of poverty in Manchester has not dissolved. The inner districts Engels once walked still carry some of the deepest deprivation recorded anywhere in England. The cotton is gone. The conditions it produced have, in some places, simply remained. The clearest measure of Manchester is in its brick. The red and blackened brick of the mills and the warehouses that still define the skyline. The chimneys are mostly gone. The looms are silent. The canals that once carried coal from the Worsley mines and raw cotton up from Liverpool now carry narrow boats running past converted lofts and reclaimed wharves, between warehouses that are no longer warehouses but look exactly like what they were. The rain that made it all possible still falls on the same streets. It falls on the warehouses that became apartments and the mills that became offices and the 1830 terminus that became a museum. It falls on the districts Engels documented and on the glass towers that rose beside them. It falls on the brick, the red and blackened brick, darkened not by coal smoke any longer, but by time, by weather, by the particular persistence of a material built to outlast the purpose it was given. The rain does not distinguish between what the city was and what it is. It falls the way it has always fallen, constant, without drama, from a low gray ceiling that does not make a spectacle of itself. The brick is wet. The street below it is the same street.